July 4th, 1857, 9 in the evening. Lower Manhattan is ablaze, not because of fireworks, because of warfare. 1,000 men are ripping each other to shreds across 6 city blocks. Bricks pour down from rooftops. Cobblestones the size of a man's skull smash through window panes. Gunshots ring out through the haze. On Bayard Street, barricades built from flipped pushcarts seal off the road, and behind them, men gripping iron rods, axes, and meat cleavers stand ready for the next assault. Corpses litter the cobblestones. Some are lifeless, some are fading. The injured drag themselves toward doorways, leaving streaks of blood in their wake. When the New York State Militia at last advances down White Street with fixed bayonets at 9 that night, they encounter a neighborhood resembling a battlefield, because that's precisely what it had become. 8 men officially dead. Maybe 30 more stashed in cellars where no one will ever locate them. More than 100 wounded, and this wasn't a scuffle between strangers. This was the Dead Rabbits against the Bowery Boys, 2 gangs that loathed one another so intensely they converted New York streets into a slaughterhouse on the very evening America was meant to be honoring its liberty. This wasn't merely another street scuffle. This was the bloodiest gang conflict New York City had witnessed since the American Revolution. 2 armies embodying 2 interpretations of what being American meant slammed into each other with full force. On one flank, the Bowery Boys, native-born, Protestant, hostile to immigrants. Draped in the flag and supported by the know-nothing political apparatus. On the opposing flank, the Dead Rabbits, Irish Catholic, famine refugees, hoisting banners displaying dead rabbits skewered on spikes. These weren't small-time crooks squabbling over a corner. These were ideological foes trapped in a battle for the city's soul. This is the account of how 2 gangs emerged from the most squalid slum in the Western world, constructed empires through blood and politics, and waged a war so savage it demanded the military to halt it. From bare-knuckle prize fights to political murders, from tenement alleyways to congressional chambers, this is the actual history of the Bowery Boys versus the Dead Rabbits. And the question sitting at its core is straightforward. Which side was more vicious? But here's what most folks misunderstand about this tale. Martin Scorsese produced a film about it. Daniel Day-Lewis earned awards portraying Bill the Butcher. But the genuine history is grimmer, weirder, and bloodier than anything Hollywood has ever depicted on screen. Because in the real 5 Points, the gangs didn't merely battle each other. They ruled the city. They dictated elections. They determined who survived and who perished. And the men commanding them weren't fictional figures. They were flesh and blood, and their tales are fiercer than any screenplay could contain. To grasp this war, you must grasp its origin. And it originated in the worst corner of America, the 5 Points, Lower Manhattan, named after the 5-pointed junction where Mulberry Street, Anthony Street, Cross Street, Orange Street, and Little Water Street all converged at one wretched intersection. In 1842, Charles Dickens came to New York City. He wandered through the 5 Points and recorded that everything there was, and I'm quoting him directly, loathsome, drooping, and decayed. Dickens had witnessed poverty throughout the world. He had chronicled London's slums, but the 5 Points unsettled him. The structures were crumbling. The streets were streams of sewage. Pigs wandered the alleyways, devouring refuse. And at its very heart sat a structure called the Old Brewery, a former commercial brewery transformed into a tenement so packed that more than 1,000 souls resided within its walls at any one moment. Families of 8 crammed into single rooms. There was no plumbing, no fresh air. The corridors were so pitch black you couldn't glimpse your own hand before your face. An estimated 1 murder per week occurred inside those walls, and the majority went unreported. This was the birthplace of organized crime in America. This is where the Dead Rabbits took root. You have to grasp what pushed people into this hellhole. Between 1,845 and 1,852, the Great Famine wiped out more than 1 million Irish lives. Another 1 million escaped. Many crossed the Atlantic and arrived in New York with nothing at all, no cash, no contacts, no future. They flooded into the 5 Points because it was the sole neighborhood that would accept them. Rents stayed low because the buildings were falling apart. And the instant they stepped off the boats, they learned something else. They were despised. Native-born New Yorkers, many Protestant, many already battling to get by in a packed city, viewed the Irish and sensed danger. They saw Catholics. They saw rivals for work. They saw people they viewed as less than human. From that hatred, 2 powers emerged. The Bowery Boys formed during the 1830s, just north of 5 Points. Along the Bowery, a broad commercial thoroughfare populated with theaters, saloons, and firehouses. The gang consisted almost entirely of volunteer firefighters. That detail is significant. During that period, fire companies weren't simply civic groups. They served as neighborhood centers of power. They fought brutally with rival companies over who got to douse fires. They were structured, they were trained, and they were already at ease with street violence long before they ever labeled themselves a gang. They sported a kind of uniform, a black silk stovepipe hat, a crimson shirt, a tribute to their fireman heritage, dark pants stuffed into heavy boots, hair combed back with grease, a half-smoked cigar jammed in the corner of the mouth. They strutted with a swagger famous throughout Lower Manhattan, and their politics were obvious. They were nativist down to the core, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant, tied to the know-nothing political faction which held that America belonged to those born on its soil and nobody else. The man who shaped the Bowery Boys into a combat unit was William Poole. Born July 24, 1821, in Sussex County, New Jersey. His father worked as a butcher. In 1832, when William was around 11, the family relocated to New York City and opened a butcher shop at Washington Market in Lower Manhattan. William picked up the craft. He handled a blade well. He handled his fists better. By his 20s, he stood 6 feet tall and tipped the scales at over 200 pounds, nimble for his frame, attractive face with a heavy mustache, and a temper capable of flipping a chat into a knife duel in 3 seconds flat. The New York Times would later characterize him this way. He was a fighter, ready for action on all occasions when he fancied he had been insulted. His spirit was haughty and overbearing. Folks called him Bill the Butcher, not because of the meat he carved at Washington Market, because of what he inflicted on human beings in the street. Poole didn't just head a gang. He constructed one. He fused his own Washington Street gang with the American Guards, the Atlantic Guards, the True Blue Americans, and the Order of the Star-Spangled Guard into a unified alliance that came to be known as the Bowery Boys. Under his leadership, they functioned as the street enforcement branch of the Know-Nothing movement. On election days, Poole and his crew stationed themselves at voting places. Their mission was simple: ensure the proper people cast ballots and the wrong ones didn't. That translated into Irish immigrants being beaten, scared off, or refused at the polls. Poole was what folks labeled a shoulder hitter, a political muscle man who relied on his fists rather than debate. In February 1853, Poole was actually chosen to represent the 6th Ward on the New York City Board of Education. That shows how deeply rooted in the system these men were. A gang chief holding a seat on an education board. Now here's where things get intriguing. Across the 5 Points, the Irish immigrants were assembling their own power network, and the man at its heart was the total opposite of Bill the Butcher. John Morrissey, born February 12, 1831, in Templemore County, Tipperary, Ireland. His family emigrated around 1833 and settled close to Troy, New York. His father, Timothy, toiled as a laborer. Funds were tight. John got virtually no formal schooling. By 12, he was laboring in a wallpaper plant, then an ironworks. Then a stove foundry. Brutal, punishing, muscle-shaping labor that molded him into something terrifying. By 1848, while still a teenager, Morrissey was already the ringleader of the downtown faction in Troy's gang conflicts, commanding street clashes against a rival called Jack O'Rourke and his uptown gang. But Morrissey craved more than Troy could deliver. In 1851, he sailed for San Francisco, pursuing the California gold rush. He didn't strike gold. He struck something better, a boxing ring. On August 31st, 1852, he beat a boxer called George Thompson at Mare Island, California. That win persuaded him he could fight for pay. He came back to New York and challenged the reigning American bare-knuckle title holder, a man called Yankee Sullivan. Morrissey triumphed. At 22, John Morrissey held the bare-knuckle boxing crown of America. You have to understand what that meant in the 1850s. Boxing wasn't a regulated pastime. It was a bloody rite. No gloves, no rounds as we now know them. No prohibition on eye-gouging, biting, or kicking. A champion wasn't merely an athlete. He was a warlord, and Morrissey leveraged that standing to amass power in the 5 points. He emerged as the rumored boss of the Dead Rabbits, the biggest Irish immigrant gang in Manhattan. The name itself is disputed. Some claim it stemmed from the gang's practice of carrying a dead rabbit skewered on a pike as their combat emblem. Others suggest it came from the Irish word rabeed, signifying a large, burly, tough man. Dead rabeed would roughly translate to very tough guy. Regardless, nobody mistook the name for fragility. The Dead Rabbits oversaw gambling rackets, protection schemes, and the supply of bootleg liquor throughout the 5 points. They were tightly interwoven with Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party political machine that wooed Irish immigrant voters. While the Bowery Boys enforced for the Know-Nothings, the Dead Rabbits enforced for Tammany. 2 gangs, 2 political machines, 2 interpretations of America. A clash was unavoidable. The private grudge between Poole and Morrissey became the focal point of the whole conflict. Poole had in fact lost cash betting against Morrissey in one of his early prize fights, and from that point forward, he loathed the Irishman. In 1854, their gangs collided at polling stations throughout Lower Manhattan, bashing each other senseless over command of ballot boxes. But the genuine showdown occurred on July 27th, 1854, at the Amos Street docks. Morrissey, furious over non-stop harassment from Poole and his gang, challenged Bill the Butcher to a bare-knuckle duel, just the 2 of them. The 2 men circled each other for roughly 30 seconds. Morrissey launched the opening blow, a left jab. Poole dodged it, grabbed Morrissey around the waist, and slammed him to the dirt. What unfolded next wasn't boxing. It was butchery. Poole mounted Morrissey and started biting, ripping, clawing, and pounding. He gouged Morrissey's right eye until blood poured down his face. He tore off a chunk of Morrissey's cheek with his teeth. By the time Morrissey's men hauled their leader away to a hospital, his face was barely identifiable. Poole had prevailed, and he made certain everyone in the 5 points knew it. But here's the thing about John Morrissey. He didn't remain beaten. He didn't forget, and he didn't pardon. On the evening of February 24th, 1855, Bill the Butcher entered Stanwix Hall, a drinking spot across from the Metropolitan Hotel on Broadway. He was there to mingle, maybe wager, maybe quarrel, which meant the same thing for Poole. In a rear room of the same establishment, John Morrissey sat at a card table, playing a calm hand with another gang associate. He sensed what was coming. 2 of Morrissey's closest lieutenants, Louis Baker and Jim Turner, were already inside the saloon. They confronted Poole. Words flew. The quarrel intensified. Then Baker pulled a pistol and shot Bill the Butcher in the leg. A separate account claims Turner fired first, striking Poole in the chest. The reports disagree on details, but the outcome doesn't. Poole collapsed. His men hauled him out. The gunshot wound in his leg went gangrenous. For 11 days, William Poole battled death the same way he battled everything else, obstinately, savagely. On March 8th, 1855, inside his residence on Christopher Street in Manhattan, Bill the Butcher at last passed away. He was 33. A newspaperman at his bedside jotted down his final words. "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." The New York Evening Post ran a different version, alleging Poole's final words identified Morrissey as his killer. His funeral was massive. Thousands crowded the streets. The Know Nothing movement elevated him into a martyr, an emblem of American nativism slain by foreign thugs. Poole's demise didn't conclude the war between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits. It dumped fuel onto it. Morrissey and Baker were indicted for Poole's murder. They stood trial. The jury couldn't reach a verdict. They walked. Tammany Hall repaid Morrissey's loyalty by handing him free rein to grow his gambling and brothel enterprises without police meddling. Old Smoke, as they nicknamed him, was now the most dominant criminal in the 5 Points. But the true eruption was still 2 years ahead. Remember this date, July 4th, 1857. During the spring of 1857, the New York State Legislature yanked Mayor Fernando Wood's authority over the city police force due to corruption. Wood retaliated by forming his own private police unit, the Municipal Police, essentially a gang of vigilantes sporting badges. Now, New York City had 2 rival police forces. The state-operated Metropolitan Police and Wood's Municipal Police. On June 16, 1857, these 2 outfits literally battled each other on the steps of City Hall. A police riot. Officers pummeling officers while criminals looked on. By July, the city was tumbling into financial collapse. The Great Panic of 1857 had wrecked the economy. Banks failed. Joblessness exploded. In the 5 Points, people were going hungry. In the Bowery, the blue-collar craftsmen who made up the Bowery Boys were losing their livelihoods. The pay-to-play political arrangement that bankrolled their operations was drying out. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Irish immigrants kept pouring into New York with nothing, hopelessness on every side, and no operational police force to maintain order. The powder keg was loaded. It just needed a spark. On the evening of July 4th, while the rest of America marked Independence Day with parades and fireworks, a bunch of dead rabbits and their partners from the Plug Uglies assembled in the 5 Points. Many were drunk. All were furious. They pushed north into the Bowery and stormed a clubhouse at 42. Bowery belonging to the Bowery Boys and the Atlantic Guards, the Bowery Boys pushed back, hard. The Dead Rabbits were forced out, but they rallied and opened a second battle front on Bayard Street, this time going after a small unit of Metropolitan Police who had tried to step in. A solo officer tried to halt the fighting. Both sides turned against him. They pummeled him unconscious and stripped off his uniform. The violence spread to Pearl Street and Chatham Street. It burned all night. Iron bars, cobblestones, bricks hurled from rooftops, knives drawn in doorways, gunshots bouncing off tenement walls, barricades assembled from pushcarts and debris. Both sides hauled their injured into cellars and back rooms. The deceased were taken away and interred in basements where their bodies would never appear in any official tally. By daybreak, the streets glistened with blood, and no one had slept. The following morning, July 5th, the rioting restarted. This time the Roach Guards joined the 5 Points Coalition, expanding the Dead Rabbits' numbers. Gangs from all over the city surged in to support one side or the other. The combat shifted to Broome Street, where the 5 Points gangs assaulted a bar named the Green Dragon, a favored Bowery haunt. Thousands of onlookers packed the surrounding streets, observing the carnage or taking part in the looting. Shops were plundered, buildings were torched. The New York Times portrayed the scene. Brickbats, stones, and clubs were flying thickly around from windows in all directions. Wounded men lay on the sidewalks and were trampled upon. The police dispatched bigger squads. They were outnumbered and overpowered. Officers charged swinging nightsticks. and were pushed back by walls of bricks. Captain Isaiah Rinders, an influential Tammany ward chief, went himself into the riot area to plead for calm. Both sides went after him. By afternoon, the police had completely lost the grip. At 9 that evening, the New York State Militia finally showed up. The 8th and 71st Regiments marched down White-and-Worth streets with fixed bayonets, drummers hammering a rhythm that bounced off tenement walls. They shoved through the barricades. They clubbed anybody who refused to vacate the street. Whether it was the bayonets or pure military discipline, the rioters cracked and fled. The Dead Rabbits withdrew into the 5 Points. The Bowery Boys retreated to their firehouses and saloons. By midnight, the streets were silent for the first time in 2 days. So which side was more vicious? You must examine the statistics and the tactics. The Bowery Boys were methodical. They leveraged their political ties to go after immigrants at the ballot box. They employed their organization as firefighters to coordinate military-style street campaigns. Bill the Butcher didn't just fight people. He mutilated them. He gouged eyes. He tore off flesh. He wielded knives with a surgeon's precision and a sadist's cruelty. Their brutality was institutional, woven into the political fabric, sheltered by the Know-Nothing movement and the American Party. The Dead Rabbits were desperate. Their brutality stemmed from survival. They fought using whatever they could grab: bricks, cobblestones, iron bars, axe shafts. They stuck dead rabbits on pikes and brought them into combat as war flags. They interred their own fallen in cellars to deny the police a body tally. During the 1857 riot, they raised barricades and converted residential streets into fortified strongholds. They treated police officers as enemy troops. When the plug uglies joined their ranks, those men donned oversized plug hats stuffed with rags as makeshift combat helmets. This wasn't organized crime as we now recognize it. This was urban guerrilla warfare. But here's what unfolded after the smoke dissipated. The Bowery Boys didn't halt. 6 years later, in July of 1863, the Civil War draft struck New York City. Congress enacted legislation permitting rich men to hand over $300 to Dodge service. Working-class men, many of them the very demographic that populated the Bowery Boys' ranks, couldn't manage the exemption. The draft riots that broke out on July 13th, 1,863, endured 3 days. They were the deadliest civil unrest in American history up until that moment. Over 100 people lost their lives. The Bowery Boys stood at the heart of it. They plundered. They burned. They lynched black residents of Manhattan. They raided a black orphanage. The draft riots exposed something the Dead Rabbits Riot had only hinted at. The Bowery Boys' brutality wasn't merely physical. It was racial. It was political. It was directed at anyone they deemed an outsider. And John Morrissey, the man who arranged the murder of Bill the Butcher, he went legit. He opened gambling parlors under Tammany Hall's cover. He relocated to Saratoga and in 1863 launched the Saratoga Springs Racecourse, which remains open today. He invested in property. He ran for Congress and triumphed twice. He served as a United States Congressman from 1867 through 1871. Then he flipped on Tammany Hall, gave testimony against Boss Tweed, and assisted in sending the most potent political boss in New York behind bars. In 1875, he captured a seat in the New York State Senate, campaigning as a Reform Democrat. John Morrissey, the bare-knuckle title holder of the 5 Points, the rumored boss of the Dead Rabbits, the man behind Bill the Butcher's assassination, perished of pneumonia on May 1st, 1878, at age 47. He died a United States Senator. The 5 Points itself was eventually leveled. The old brewery was pulled down in 1853 by the Ladies' Home Missionary Society. Block by block, the neighborhood was swept away. Today, the crossroads where Mulberry, Worth, and Baxter Streets converge is home to Columbus Park in Lower Manhattan. There's no plaque, no monument, nothing to inform you that this peaceful green patch was once the most hazardous spot in the Western Hemisphere. Nothing to inform you that men slaughtered each other here with bricks and iron bars while a city burned all around them. So who was more vicious? The Bowery Boys, who converted nativism into structured violence, who clubbed immigrants at polling places, who rioted against the Civil War draft and lynched innocent people. Or the Dead Rabbits, who fought for survival with cobblestones and axe handles, who erected barricades in the streets, who buried their dead in cellars to keep battling. The truthful answer is this: they were both vicious. But they were vicious in different manners, for different motives. The Bowery Boys held power and used violence to preserve it. The Dead Rabbits had nothing and used violence to seize it. One gang fought to shut others out. The other fought to fit in. And the city they each claimed as their own nearly burned down because of it. That's the authentic story of the gangs of New York. Not the Hollywood rendition. Not the romanticized myth. The reality. Two bands of men, molded by poverty, hatred, and ambition, who transformed the streets of Lower Manhattan into a battle zone that required the United States military to shut it down. The Bowery Boys vanished after the Civil War. The Dead Rabbits dissolved into newer, more structured crime organizations that would ultimately grow into the modern American Mafia. But the template they created, gangs linked with political machines, violence as an instrument of power, ethnic conflict exploited for profit, that template never disappeared. It merely shifted its location. The streets have been paved over. The tenements have been demolished. But if you stroll through Lower Manhattan today, past the courthouses on Center Street, past the government buildings on Worth Street, you are treading above graves, unmarked, uncounted. The men who fought in the Dead Rabbits Riot, the men who bled on Bayard Street and perished in the cellars of the 5 Points, they remain down there. And their tale, the real tale, is one that America has never truly confronted. If you found this tale gripping, hit subscribe. We release a new documentary every week. Leave a comment below. Who do you believe was more vicious, the Bowery Boys or the Dead Rabbits? And which gang from old New York should we tackle next? Untold tales from the realm of organized crime.